Hello Reddit. I, 60F, find myself in the most challenging period of my life, and I desperately need your advice. 27 years ago, I adopted my son, who is now 27 years old. The journey that led me to this point has been filled with love, joy, and now, heartbreak. I never imagined I'd be in this situation, feeling like a stranger to the child I raised and loved with all my heart. When my son was just 2 years old, he came into my life like a whirlwind of hope and happiness. His birth parents were facing severe personal issues that made it impossible for them to care for him. The social worker who handled his case told me that they had made the difficult decision to put him up for adoption, hoping he would find a stable and loving home. At the time, I was single but had a stable career as a high school teacher and was more than ready to provide a loving home. The adoption process was lengthy and emotionally taxing. There were home visits, interviews, background checks, and mountains of paperwork. There were moments when I feared it might not happen, that I might lose this child I already loved so deeply. But the moment I held him in my arms and he was officially mine, I knew it was all worth it. I remember looking into his big brown eyes and promising him that I would always be there for him, no matter what. As a single mother, I poured all my love and energy into raising my son. We had our challenges, of course. There were nights when he would cry inconsolably, and I would pace the floor with him, singing lullabies until my voice was hoarse. There were times when I felt overwhelmed, wondering if I was doing enough, if I was a good enough mother. But watching him grow and thrive filled my life with purpose and joy. I made sure he had every opportunity. I attended every school play, cheered at every soccer game, and stayed up countless nights helping with homework or comforting him after nightmares. I remember his first day of kindergarten, how he clung to my leg, afraid to let go. I knelt down, looked him in the eye, and told him how brave he was, how proud I was of him. By the end of the day, he was chattering excitedly about his new friends and his kind teacher. We were a team, just the two of us against the world. On weekends, we'd have movie nights with popcorn and blanket forts. During summers, we'd go on camping trips, roasting marshmallows and telling stories under the stars. I taught him how to ride a bike, how to tie his shoelaces, how to stand up to bullies. And he taught me the joy of seeing the world through a child's eyes, the unconditional love that can exist between a mother and son. When my son turned 16, I decided it was time to have an in-depth conversation about his adoption. I had always been open about the fact that he was adopted, but I felt he was now old enough to understand more details. I sat him down one evening after dinner, my heart pounding with nervousness. I shared what I knew about his birth parents, including the letter and photo they had left for him. I remember how his hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope containing the letter. I watched his face carefully as he read, ready to offer comfort if needed. To my relief, he took the information well. He asked thoughtful questions about his birth parents and the circumstances of his adoption. If anything, it seemed to strengthen our bond. He appreciated my honesty and the love I had shown him throughout his life. That night, as I was tucking him into bed, yes, even at 16, he sometimes let me do that, he hugged me tightly and said, "You know you're my real mom, right? No matter what." Those words meant the world to me, and I held on to them in the difficult years that would follow. As my son grew into a young man, I couldn't have been prouder. He excelled in school, made wonderful friends, and developed into a kind, intelligent individual. He had a passion for environmental science and would often regale me with facts about climate change and conservation efforts. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself learning alongside him. When he was accepted into a prestigious college to study environmental science, I was over the moon with pride. I knew it would be a financial stretch, but I was determined to make it work. I took on extra tutoring jobs after school and on weekends, dipped into my savings, and even took out a small loan to ensure he could attend without the burden of student loans. Seeing him graduate, watching him walk across that stage to receive his diploma, was one of the happiest days of my life. I remember thinking, we did it. Together, we did it. It was during his senior year of college that he met his now fiancée, 26F. She was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law, kind, intelligent, and clearly head over heels in love with my son. She shared his passion for environmental issues and had a warm, infectious laugh that immediately put people at ease. I welcomed her into our little family with open arms, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. We would have Sunday dinners together, the three of us, laughing and sharing stories. I taught her some of my son's favorite recipes, and she would often call me for advice, not just about cooking but about life in general. I started to dream about the future, maybe grandchildren, family holidays with a house full of love and laughter. I thought our little family was complete and unshakable. However, about 6 months ago, everything changed. My son announced that he had managed to track down and contact his birth parents. He told me over one of our Sunday dinners, his eyes shining with excitement. At first, I was supportive. I understood his curiosity and hoped this would bring him some closure. I told him to be careful and take things slowly, but I was happy he might get some answers to questions he'd had his whole life. I remember asking him if he wanted me to go with him when he met them for the first time. He declined, saying he needed to do this on his own. I respected his decision, but a small part of me felt a twinge of hurt. Still, I pushed those feelings aside, reminding myself that this wasn't about me. It was about my son finding a missing piece of himself. What happened in the following weeks was alarming, to say the least. My son became obsessed with his birth parents. He would cancel plans with me to spend time with them. Our weekly Sunday dinners became sporadic, and when we did have them, his fiancée would often come alone, making excuses for my son's absence. This became very apparent when he decided to spend the 4th of July with them, a holiday we had always celebrated together since he was a child. We had a tradition of watching fireworks from the hill near our house, sharing a picnic and making s'mores. When he called to tell me he wouldn't be coming, I felt a deep ache in my chest. I spent that 4th of July alone, watching the fireworks and remembering all the years we had spent together on that hill. When I did see my son, all he could talk about was how cool his birth parents were, how they were finding themselves, and how they had really turned their lives around. He spoke about their shared interests in music and art, things I had never been particularly skilled at. I found myself feeling increasingly insecure, wondering if he was comparing me to them and finding me lacking. I learned through the grapevine mutual friends and family members who had met or heard about the birth parents that things weren't as rosy as my son believed. His birth parents were still struggling with their personal issues. They frequently got into fights with neighbors, had a history of going in and out of rehabilitation programs, were unable to maintain steady employment, and lived in a small, run-down apartment. Despite this, my son seemed oblivious to their struggles, only seeing an idealized version of them that he had constructed in his mind. I tried to gently point out some concerns, but he accused me of being jealous and trying to sabotage his relationship with his real parents. That phrase cut deep. It felt like all the years of love, all the skinned knees I had bandaged, all the nightmares I had soothed, all the proud moments we had shared, were being erased. Then came the announcement of the upcoming wedding. My son and his fiancée were officially engaged, and I was overjoyed. Despite the recent tension, I pushed aside my hurt feelings and focused on celebrating this milestone. I immediately offered to cover the wedding expenses, knowing it would be a financial strain, but my son's and future daughter-in-law's happiness meant everything to me. They graciously accepted, and together we began the intricate process of planning the wedding. I threw myself into the planning, seeing it as a way to reconnect with my son. We looked at venues together, tasted cakes, and discussed color schemes. For a while, it felt like old times. I allowed myself to hope that things were getting back to normal, that this obsession with his birth parents was just a phase that would pass. But 2 months into the wedding planning, my son dropped a bombshell. He called me one evening, his voice excited but with an undercurrent of nervousness. He expressed his desire for his birth parents to take on significant roles in the wedding ceremony. He wanted his birth father to walk him down the aisle, his birth mother to share the mother-son dance, and both of them to give speeches at the reception. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. All the air seemed to leave my lungs, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Not once did my son ask for my opinion or how I felt about this new arrangement. He was merely informing me, as if I was an afterthought, a footnote in his life rather than the woman who had raised him. When I finally found my voice and tried to talk to him about it, to understand his reasoning, he became defensive. His voice took on an edge I had never heard before. He accused me of trying to erase his heritage and pretend his real parents didn't exist. I assured him that wasn't the case at all, that I just wanted to be part of his special day too. I reminded him of all we had been through together, of the life we had built. But my son wouldn't budge. In fact, it got worse. He announced that he didn't want me to have any special role in the wedding at all. I could attend as a regular guest, but that was it. No walking down the aisle, no special dances, no speeches. Nothing. He said he wanted the focus to be on his real family, and that my participation in anything was just confusing. I was absolutely devastated. The son I had raised for 27 years, the child I had loved with every fiber of my being, was treating me like a stranger. It felt like my heart was being torn from my chest. I couldn't understand how we had gotten to this point. How had my sweet, loving boy turned into this person I barely recognized? Despite the hurt it caused, I continued to offer my support, both emotionally and financially. I kept reminding myself that my son was grappling with difficult emotions and that his behavior was likely just a phase. I held on to hope that he would come to his senses, that he would remember all we had shared and realize that family is about more than just blood. I tried to reach out to his fiancée, hoping she might be able to talk some sense into him. But she seemed distant and uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle of a situation she didn't know how to handle. I couldn't blame her, but I felt increasingly isolated. However, my hopes were shattered when my son took a drastic step. He called me one evening, his voice cold and detached. He expressed that he no longer wanted me to attend the wedding at all. He explained that my presence would be too complicated and might confuse the guests about who his real parents were. Instead, he suggested that I could watch the ceremony through a live stream if I wished to participate. I was at a complete loss. The pain was indescribable. It felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. After a long and heartfelt conversation with my closest friend, who had been my rock throughout this ordeal, I made the difficult decision to retract my offer to financially support my son's wedding. It wasn't out of spite or anger, but out of a realization that I needed to protect myself emotionally and financially. I communicated to my son that if he felt uncomfortable with my presence or my financial contribution, I would not impose myself upon him. I also informed him that his birth parents were more than welcome to assume the responsibility for the wedding expenses. My voice shook as I said these words, part of me still hoping he would realize what he was throwing away and change his mind. To my surprise and heartbreak, my son's reaction was not one of disappointment but rather of apparent relief. He expressed that it was probably for the best and that his real parents had offered to cover all the expenses anyway. This revelation was both shocking and bewildering. I could feel my heart shattering as my son hung up on me, not even bothering to say goodbye. In the weeks that followed, I was dealing with a profound sense of grief. It felt like I was mourning the death of my child, even though he was still alive. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I would find myself wandering into his old room, touching his childhood toys and yearbooks, wondering where I had gone wrong. I heard through friends and family that the wedding planning was in disarray. Vendors weren't getting paid on time, the venue was threatening to cancel, and the wedding planner was apparently telling the couple to lower their expectations for the products and consider changing the venue. On top of that, my son's birth parents were making big promises that they couldn't live up to. It all sounded like chaos. I was in a tough spot. A part of me wanted to jump in and fix everything for my son, to show him how much I cared. The mother in me couldn't bear the thought of his special day being ruined. But then I also felt that my son needed to face the consequences of his choices. In the end, I decided to stay out of it, even though it deeply pained me. The only effort I made was to call my son's fiancée once, but when she didn't pick up, I knew it was time to back off completely. It would be dishonest if I said I didn't hope that my son would change his mind at the last moment. I prayed that he would realize what he was throwing away, that he would remember all the love and memories we shared. I hoped he would at least let me be part of the wedding, even if it meant sitting at the back as a stranger. That's why when my doorbell rang at 11 p.m. the night before the wedding, I rushed to open the door, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. But it wasn't who I was expecting. It wasn't my son coming to his senses. It was my son's fiancée, and she was in tears. Now, I find myself at a crossroads. My son, the child I raised and loved for 27 years, has essentially cut me out of his life. His fiancée is distraught, the wedding is in shambles, and I'm left wondering where I went wrong. Did I unknowingly drive my son away? Should I have handled the situation differently? How do I move forward from here? I'm turning to you, Reddit, for support and advice. I'm a parent shattered by the loss of my son and the future I had envisioned. How do I navigate this heartbreaking situation? Should I try to reach out to my son again, or give him space? Any insights or similar experiences would be greatly appreciated. I feel lost and alone, and I don't know where to turn. Update 1. Thank you all for your advice and support. The situation has taken a dramatic turn, and I'm still trying to process everything that's happened. Last night, around 11 p.m., my son's fiancée, 26F, showed up at my doorstep in tears. I was shocked to see her, especially given the late hour and the fact that the wedding was supposed to be the next day. As soon as I opened the door, she collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Once I managed to calm her down enough to speak, she revealed the true extent of what had been going on. It turns out my son had been lying to her about the situation with me. He had told her that I refused to attend the wedding because I didn't want his birth parents there. He even claimed that I had suddenly withdrawn my financial support out of spite, leaving them scrambling to cover the costs. I was stunned. I couldn't believe my son would lie so blatantly, especially to the woman he was planning to marry. As gently as I could, I explained the real situation to her, how my son had gradually pushed me out of the wedding plans, how he had told me my presence would be confusing, and how I had only withdrawn my financial support after being uninvited from the wedding entirely. The fiancée was horrified. She had no idea things had gotten so bad between my son and me. She kept apologizing for not reaching out to me sooner, saying she should have known something wasn't right. Apparently, she had been feeling increasingly uneasy about the whole situation but didn't know how to address it. As we talked more, she revealed how much my son had changed since reconnecting with his birth parents. She described him becoming more aggressive and easily frustrated, often lashing out at her over minor issues. This was so unlike the kind, patient man I had raised, and it broke my heart to hear. The fiancé also shared a disturbing conversation she had overheard between my son and his birth mother. The woman was telling my son that he needed to make sure his wife always respected his opinions and that it was her duty to do so. I was appalled. This kind of outdated, misogynistic thinking was completely at odds with how I had raised my son to view relationships. But the revelations didn't stop there. The fiancé went on to describe the chaos surrounding the wedding preparations. Despite my son's assurances that his birth parents would cover all the expenses, almost nothing had been paid for. Vendors were threatening to pull out, the venue was on the verge of canceling, and the whole thing was falling apart. When she had tried to discuss these issues with my son, he became defensive and evasive. He made excuses for his birth parents, saying things like, "How could they bring such a huge amount at the last moment?" This was particularly galling given that they had months of notice and had promised to cover the costs. The fiancée was at her wits' end. She felt betrayed by my son's lies and manipulation, and she was deeply concerned about his drastic personality change. She also expressed fear about entering a marriage with someone who seemed to have such a skewed view of relationship dynamics. After hours of talking and many tears from both of us, the fiancée made a decision that clearly pained her but which she felt was necessary. She was calling off the wedding. She couldn't marry someone who could treat their family, their real family, with such disregard. She was also deeply troubled by my son's apparent ease with lying to her about the situation. I was stunned. Part of me was proud of her for taking a stand and recognizing the red flags in the relationship. But another part of me was devastated. I had loved this young woman like a daughter, and now I was losing her too. I was also mourning the future I had envisioned: grandchildren, family holidays, a growing family filled with love and laughter. As dawn broke, the fiancée left, determined to break the news to my son and her own family. I sat in my quiet living room, trying to process everything that had happened. The wedding was off. My son had lied and manipulated the situation. His birth parents had failed to follow through on their promises. And I was left feeling more lost and heartbroken than ever. I don't know what will happen next. Will my son finally see the error of his ways? Will he reach out to me? Or will this drive an even deeper wedge between us? I'm scared for him, worried about the influence his birth parents seem to have over him, and unsure of how to move forward. I'm also concerned about my son's mental and emotional state. The fiancé mentioned that he's been drinking heavily lately, something he never used to do. Given the history of addiction in his biological family, this is particularly alarming. I want to reach out to him, to offer support and help, but I'm afraid he'll reject me again. To make matters worse, I've heard through mutual friends that my son's birth parents have been spreading their own version of events. They're telling anyone who will listen that I stole their child from them, that they never wanted to give him up for adoption, and that I sabotaged the wedding out of jealousy over their involvement. It's all lies, of course, but I'm worried about the impact this could have on my relationships with extended family and friends. I feel like I'm in an impossible situation. If I try to defend myself and tell the truth, I risk pushing my son even further away. But if I stay silent, these lies could damage my reputation and relationships. I've spent my entire adult life being the best mother I could be, and now I'm being painted as some kind of villain. I'm grateful for all the support and advice I've received from this community. Right now, I'm focusing on taking care of myself and processing all of these emotions. I've reached out to a therapist who specializes in adoption-related family issues, and I have an appointment scheduled for next week. I'm also trying to stay busy to keep my mind off things. I've thrown myself into my garden, finding some small comfort in nurturing plants when I can't nurture my son. I've also been spending more time with friends, grateful for their unwavering support during this difficult time. As for my son, I'm giving him space for now. I've decided to write him a letter expressing my love for him and my hopes for reconciliation, but I haven't sent it yet. I'm waiting to see if he reaches out first, hoping against hope that he'll come to his senses. Update 2. It's been a week since the wedding was called off, and I've been doing a lot of reflecting on my son's life and our relationship. I thought sharing some of this might help me process everything and maybe provide some context for those who've been following my situation. My son was a loving, affectionate child when he first came to me at age 2. However, he struggled with separation anxiety more than most kids his age. Dropping him off at daycare was always a tearful ordeal that would last much longer than it did for other children. His pediatrician and a child therapist helped us work through this, advising me on how to build his sense of security and confidence. It was a long, challenging process, but we got through it together. Academically, my son excelled in elementary school. His teachers often praised his intelligence and curiosity. However, he had difficulty forming friendships. He was shy and sometimes struggled to connect with his peers. To help him develop social skills, I encouraged him to join clubs and sports teams. Gradually, he became more comfortable in social situations and started to make friends. As a teenager, my son went through what I'd call a typical rebellious phase. There were arguments, slammed doors, and the occasional "you're not my real mom" thrown out in the heat of the moment. Each time he said it, it stung, but he always apologized afterward, and I tried not to take it personally. I knew it was part of him grappling with his identity and place in the world. Around age 16, my son became deeply fascinated with understanding his own personal identity. He dove into extensive online research about different personality types and spent a lot of time trying to figure out where he belonged. This manifested in him experimenting with various styles of dress and music, his appearance changing noticeably from week to week. While I encouraged his journey of self-discovery, I was concerned about how quickly he'd abandon one identity for another. There was also a period when my son was about 16 when he became obsessed with the idea of finding his true self. He started questioning everything about his upbringing, including my parenting decisions. There were times when he accused me of not understanding him and of trying to mold him into someone he wasn't. I was taken aback because I had always tried to support his individuality and interests. We encouraged my son to explore his feelings in therapy, which he agreed to for a while. The therapist helped him work through some of his anger and confusion, and things seemed to improve. By the time he left for college, I thought he had worked through most of these issues. Looking back, maybe these were signs of the identity struggles that would surface later, but at the time, it just seemed like normal teenage identity formation. My son appeared to have moved past these concerns, excelling in college and seeming more comfortable with himself. Now, in light of recent events, I'm reevaluating these memories. I'm trying to understand if I missed any crucial signs or if there was more I could have done to help my son feel secure in his identity and his place in our family. I've also been thinking a lot about nature versus nurture. Did my son inherit some predisposition to addiction or instability from his birth parents? Or is his current behavior solely a result of their influence now? I know these questions don't have easy answers, but they keep me up at night. To add to my concerns, I've recently learned some troubling information about my son's current state. A colleague of his reached out to me, expressing worry about his behavior at work. Apparently, my son has been showing up late, missing deadlines, and snapping at coworkers, all completely out of character for him. There's concern that his job may be at risk if this continues. I've also discovered that my son has been frequenting a local bar almost nightly. A family friend spotted him there several times, always alone and appearing despondent. This is particularly concerning given the history of addiction in his biological family. I'm terrified that he might be heading down a similar path. Moreover, I've learned from a mutual acquaintance that my son has withdrawn a significant amount of money from his savings account. I'm worried about what this might mean. Is he sending money to his birth parents? Has he fallen into some sort of financial trouble? A neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked outside my son's apartment at odd hours. I'm concerned about the company he might be keeping and hope he's not falling in with a bad crowd. All of this information makes me want to rush to my son's side and try to fix everything. But I know I can't. He's an adult, and he's made it clear that he doesn't want my involvement in his life right now. It's killing me to stand by and watch him potentially self-destruct, but I don't know what else to do. I've been trying to take care of myself through all of this. I've started seeing a therapist to work through my feelings of guilt, loss, and confusion. I'm also trying to stay busy. I've taken up gardening, and my husband has returned to his old hobby of woodworking. It helps to have something to focus on besides our worry for our son. I've also joined a support group for parents of estranged children. It helps to know I'm not alone in this situation, even though I wish none of us had to go through it. Hearing others' stories and how they've coped has given me some perspective and coping strategies. Despite everything, I still love my son deeply. I'm trying to hold on to hope that he'll find his way back to us eventually. But I'm also working on accepting that I can't control the situation or force him to change his mind. For now, I'm leaving the door open. I've told my son, through a brief text message, since he's not answering calls, that I'm here if he needs me, no questions asked. I'm trying to respect his desire for space while also letting him know he's still loved and welcome. I don't know what the future holds. Will my son eventually see through his birth parents' manipulation? Will he realize the damage he's doing to his life and relationships? Or will he continue down this path, potentially cutting me out of his life for good? These questions haunt me, but I'm trying to take things one day at a time. If anyone has been through a similar situation or has any advice on how to cope with this ongoing uncertainty, I'd appreciate hearing from you. This community has been a source of support through this difficult time, and I'm grateful for that. I'll update again if there are any significant developments. For now, I'm trying to focus on healing and on the aspects of my life that I can control. It's not easy, but I'm doing my best to stay strong and hopeful. Update 3. It's been a month since my last update. I've been exploring family therapy options and consulted several professionals. My therapist, specializing in adoption issues, suggested family therapy could help if my son agrees. I texted him about it, but his response was curt, "I don't need therapy. I'm fine." My son's situation seems to be worsening. A coworker and family friend told me he's consistently late to work, missing deadlines, and snapping at colleagues. There have been HR complaints, and he's on thin ice with management. The same coworker mentioned my son often comes to work disheveled and smelling of alcohol. His financial situation is precarious. He's withdrawn large sums from his savings and has been late on rent. His landlord called me, concerned about potentially evicting him. I offered to cover his rent, but she refused, saying it wouldn't solve the underlying problem. The relationship between my son and his birth parents is changing. They've become less available, canceling plans often. This erratic behavior seems to be affecting my son's emotional state. A neighbor told me he often hears arguing from my son's apartment late at night, sometimes seemingly on the phone, other times alone. The neighbor has also noticed strangers coming and going at odd hours. I'm grappling with whether to intervene more directly. Part of me wants to confront him and get him help, but I fear pushing him further away. I've been attending a support group for parents of estranged adult children. Many have advised against forcing contact, suggesting I make it clear I'm here when he's ready. I've started sending my son a weekly text, just saying I love him and I'm here if he needs me. He hasn't responded, but at least he's not blocking my number. I've been in touch with my son's ex-fiancée. She's blocked him on all platforms after he alternated between apologies and angry accusations. While I understand her decision, it saddens me to see my son losing another support system. I've been researching adoption, identity issues, and addiction extensively. A memoir by an adoptee who reconnected with birth parents as an adult gave me new perspective on my son's possible feelings. I'm also focusing on self-care. I've started meditation and yoga, which has helped manage anxiety and improve sleep. My therapist encourages setting boundaries and taking care of my own needs. I've considered contacting my son's birth parents directly but decided against it on my therapist's advice. It could complicate things further. Looking ahead, I'm preparing for various outcomes. I hope my son will eventually seek help and rebuild his life, but I'm also trying to accept that this might not happen as I envision. I'm working on forgiveness of my son, his birth parents, and myself. My therapist is helping me work through feelings of guilt and self-doubt. This journey has taught me the importance of patience and perseverance. Healing and reconciliation, if they come, will likely be a long process. I'm taking it one day at a time, holding on to hope while preparing for the possibility that our relationship may never be what it once was. I'll update if there are significant changes. Until then, I'll keep working on myself and hoping for the best. Update 4. I can't believe I'm writing this, but there's been a significant development in my situation. Last night, around 1 a.m., I received a call from my son. At first, I thought it might be a mistake or a drunk dial, given the hour. But when I answered, I heard something I hadn't heard in months, my son's voice, choked with tears. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the pain and regret in his voice. "I'm so sorry. I've messed up everything." For the next hour, my son poured out his heart to me. He apologized for his behavior, for pushing me away, for the hurtful things he'd said and done. He admitted that reconnecting with his birth parents had affected him more than he'd anticipated. The idealized version of them he'd constructed in his mind clashed harshly with reality, leaving him confused and angry. He confessed that his birth parents had been manipulating him, constantly asking for money and making him feel guilty if he hesitated. They'd play on his emotions, questioning his loyalty and love for them. This manipulation had taken a toll on his mental health, leading to his erratic behavior and drinking. My son also revealed that he'd hit rock bottom recently. He'd lost his job due to his poor performance and had been evicted from his apartment. He'd been staying with a friend, but the situation was tense. It was only when he found himself alone, with nowhere else to turn, that he realized how much he'd thrown away. What broke my heart the most was hearing him say, "I thought I was finding my real family, but I had a real family all along. I just couldn't see it." He told me he'd cut off all contact with his birth parents. Apparently, the final straw was when he overheard them planning to ask him for a large sum of money, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate him. This shocking revelation made him see their true colors. My son also mentioned that he'd reached out to his ex-fiancée to apologize and return some money he'd borrowed from her. He didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation, but he felt it was important to make amends. As for our relationship, my son expressed a deep desire to repair the damage he'd caused. He asked if I'd be willing to attend family therapy with him, saying he realized he needed professional help to work through his issues. Of course, I agreed immediately. I won't lie, a part of me is wary. The hurt is still raw, and I'm afraid of being let down again. But hearing the genuine remorse in my son's voice gave me hope. It's a start, a chance to rebuild what we've lost. We ended the call with plans to meet for coffee in a few days. It's a small step, but an important one. I'm trying to manage my expectations and take things slowly, but I can't deny the surge of hope I feel. After the call, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with a mix of emotions: relief, hope, lingering hurt, and cautious optimism. I reached out to my therapist first thing in the morning and scheduled an emergency session to process everything. My therapist reminded me to take things one day at a time. She advised me to be supportive but also to maintain healthy boundaries. We're going to work on strategies for rebuilding trust and navigating this new chapter in our relationship. I've also contacted a family therapist who specializes in adoption issues. We have our first joint session scheduled for next week. I'm nervous but hopeful that this will provide a safe space for us to work through our issues. As for my son's immediate needs, I've offered to help him find a new apartment and job. He initially refused, not wanting to take advantage of me again, but I insisted. We agreed that he would pay me back when he's back on his feet, and that this support is contingent on him staying in therapy and working on himself. I know we have a long road ahead of us. Years of hurt and misunderstandings can't be erased with one phone call. There will likely be setbacks and difficult conversations. But for the first time in months, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. To those who've followed my story and offered support, thank you. Your advice and shared experiences have been a lifeline during this difficult time. I'll update again as things progress. For now, I'm cautiously optimistic and taking things one day at a time.